Broken Thing. Chapter 19. Cara lay on her side, trembling with pain, adrenaline, horror, and anticipation of more of all the same, and the visceral probability of much worse. He can always make it worse. Trembling was what had given her away in the first place. She had been desperate enough to try because she no longer had any guaranteed opportunities to try. She may never have an opportunity to try again. That may have been the end. She had no ability to predict what Thane would do when he was angry, which she had not seen before, or if she had not remembered. She thought she remembered it all now, and she thought he believed the same. She at least remembered enough for him to have to keep her restrained. Thane had always had enough power to be in control, calmly and quietly threatening, and now he had lost much of his control. Some of the anger in his eyes had been at himself, that he had given up his perimeter, his power, his dominion, and taken a risk on releasing her into the wild. She had fought to imbalance him when she could, from laughing on the shuttle to smiling at him as though she were counting his severed body parts for inventory. She was not afraid of consequences to her personally as much as she was afraid of how he could use her to hurt other people. She could no longer prevent him hurting other people by following simple rules. She was less afraid of him inflicting pain on her than she was afraid of him inflicting pleasure on her. Much more effective in her case, as he knew. Not that pain was her favorite thing, but she could endure it much better than she could endure collusion with him. Part of her anger was with herself there, because she had told him, haughtily, what she did not wish to do, and he had made her do it. Made them do it. Beckenstein had been hard, but ultimately it had only been her at risk, and she had wanted to survive. She no longer had survival as her main goal. If he killed her, he couldn't use her, and that's what mattered now. She was out of time. The stakes no longer her life or Garrus's life or a few people on an estate. Now, with the depth and breadth of Leviathan interest, with what he was doing, creating theater and progress updates that had absolutely nothing to do with any progress she was making. The idea of hearing loss resulting in release of hypnotic compulsion had occurred to her while she was on Beckenstein, but it had been an unusable idea at the time. Her main concern had been getting off the planet, not getting off the grounds. He had explained Beckenstein's policies, and she had believed him. He had been telling the truth. One of many truths he told. He need not lie when the truth would serve. He told both truth and lie with exactly the same amount of conviction, and she could not tell which was which. It had been true that only he could authorize exit from the estate. That was one of the reasons, beyond the pleasure of her company and protection, why he always kept her in sight when there were a few guests at the estate, or on his arm when there were many guests. Her most potentially successful path off the estate would have been to escape with someone who had prior authorization, and they both knew it. Forcing him in any way to authorize or facilitate her escape would have been impossible. There was nothing he cared about beyond her. She had no leverage, no path to persuade him to do anything he did not wish to do. His venom made him immune to most hypnotic or coercive agents. He had considered how to counteract a sorry influence. And pain. Pain meant nothing to him other than as an inconvenience, a debt to be repaid tenfold, and a waste of time. Attempting to inflict it on him would be an insult to his fortitude and endurance. Trying to hurt him, even succeeding in hurting him, wouldn't accomplish anything at all other than wrath directed not at her, but someone else. He would be uncooperative, counting his moments until he was in control again or dead. Either would be an acceptable outcome in his mind if what was asked of him was something he was not willing to give. She wasn't afraid to hurt him. He wasn't afraid to hurt her. It just wasn't a path toward collusion for either of them. He had every living person in existence to hold hostage against her behavior, and she had nothing. Eventually, the only thing he wanted was her, and on the subject of her, his practicalities deserted him. She was his shores, the place itself, and the only person he wished to meet there. He had decided she was the embodiment of his ambitions, a goddess in whom he had faith. He would not recant upon his deathbed or any bed of nails. There were 2 deep injuries in her, to the bone, and surrounded by the unapproachable. It wasn't that he had taken her. It was that he hadn't killed her. He told her it was because he couldn't bear the loss of her eyes, that someone else would take the contract and deprive the galaxy of her eyes, and that would have been an incalculable loss. The second injury was that she was no longer on Beckenstein. He had given her any number of self-deprecating and mocking reasons. He'd said he was bored. He'd said he wished to survive in a galaxy free of Reapers. Once, without the question being asked at all, he had taken her chin in his hand, warm blue biotic glow and patches on his skin, and told her all his riches and theater meant nothing if her riches went unappreciated. That he had been wrong about her proper setting, that he did not care if he deprived the galaxy of her eyes, but her eyes deserved more than the rooms of her captivity and only his creations to behold. He told her that her eyes deserved the right to behold the galaxy as her due. He had spared her life. He had let her out. Neither of those choices made any sense, and she imagined those were his 2 deepest injuries also, to the bone and unapproachable. She could get lost there, examining those wounds from a distance, his and hers, his practicality defied by his poetry and hope, her martyrdom defied by calm and comfort. While captive on Beckenstein, hearing loss had occurred to her, but it had been a vague curiosity, and she had not known at the time if sound was processed through a translator or through ears. She had no access to her translator and was not about to waste her chance at the attempt, only to find that sound was processed independently of the ears. There was no way to find out, no way to test or plan. She had not been afraid to tell him, so his question about what she did not want to tell him did not trigger any response on the subject. Upon getting control over her translator back, she had not known to look specifically for the information, but she had learned it as a happenstance, a side benefit of her curiosity. She'd learned more about the exclusive and inclusive language processing, learned more than the default setting, and tangentially, she'd learned that the device depended on functional ears. He had caught her attempt at escape from compulsion because he knew her. Her behavior, her motivations, her face, her eyes, her posture, too well. With his Drell precision and his whatever it was. He knew her. Was he able to pick up on tension from pain she couldn't suppress? Could he just feel it when she was different, having tested her in every state? The same way she could feel that she knew, without enough information to decide logically, she knew she had to kill him now or never. He knew everything about her, had spent months pulling what he wanted from her like a skein he could unravel and catalog by the inch. He read her eyes, he said. Every time, he told her that what gave her away was her eyes, but she never remembered that part because he asked her to forget it. So very many things he had asked her to forget, arriving in her mind now, unexpected guests. To hear him tell it, his world had begun and would end in her eyes. She didn't know what Senar had said to her to test her, but the way his mouth had moved, it looked like it might have been Turian speech. It had been a huge risk. She'd known it had a low chance of success to get far enough to kill him, but she had shown him something she could do. She had proven she could do it. She had taken away his certainty that he knew her well enough to prevent everything. She'd watched the amusement and knowledge of control slip out of his eyes to be replaced by anger, and that felt good on its own. She'd been lying in her own blood, adrenaline, and pained sweat for too long, waiting for him to turn away so she could rupture an eardrum without screaming. And then she had waited in silence, ringing with only pain and hope for him to turn to her. You could probably not only see it in her eyes, but smell it on her skin from a distance. She'd been struggling not to pass out from pain and exhaustion, afraid he'd find her that way unconscious, discover her injuries, and she'd miss the entire thing. It had seemed like an eternity, though it had probably only been 3 or 4 hours. Whatever he was doing, what he wanted was time, and she had to prevent that. She didn't remember Leviathan, and that was terrifying. She remembered everything else terrifying. She had helped him. She had been his accomplice, if not mastermind. But now he had access to anything he could want and did not need her unless it was for her eyes. She did not believe that even for his own survival, he wanted to save the galaxy. That would be... She couldn't even come up with something stupid or short-sighted enough for that to be. Maybe Dralafa, dumb, and that level of delusion to think that was his goal. Maybe she knew him well also, his ambitions, the way his mind worked. Why save a galaxy if he had found an escape route? That's what she saw now, not her path forward to ending Reapers. Now he saw his own path, and she did not know what that was, but she knew it was bad. She could not forget all the time she gave him her best advice, and other than sex, that's what he needed her for, wanted her for. He wanted them to do it together. She was still, as she was, on Beckenstein, window dressing, strategy, and sex on tap. The sick twisting of the way he knew her, the intimacy of them, was inescapable internally. She could not move or think without being reminded of him somehow, and she couldn't tell if that was what he wanted. Some compulsion he'd put in her head so everything led to him, or the fact that she couldn't experience her ears hurting without, eventually, thinking of the things he'd whispered to her with her ears whole and hungry. As he'd pointed out and had her demonstrate so many times. That hunger was a standalone thing that answered to his body and voice, and not to her protestations. That's also why seeing his smile fade, no matter how painful, had been worth it. It would be so much easier if every association with him were painful. She could retain her separate identity. Instead, he knew her sense of humor, and he respected her. He enjoyed her company. He took care, assuring she was entertained or comfortable, even in times when he was in pain, times he could have lost his temper, made her pay for whatever. Instead, he'd given her kindness and forbearance, and not just indulgently or when there was kindness or comfort enough for both of them. As though that kindness or comfort belonged to her, if he was there to provide it. As though he were hers. When he apologized for not being able to keep her in comfort, he meant that. It pained him. He wanted to kill her, but it pained him. That he wanted to kill her pained him. That she wanted to kill him, he approved. She did want to kill him, and would not have stopped if he'd been helpless, and she'd had her hand to his throat. He knew that, too. His approval of her potential competence faded in face of her real competence. Or had it? She wasn't dead. It hadn't faded enough for her purposes. He did wish that she could care for him, or his comfort. He knew in every galling moment that she cared most about ending him. He resented the lengths of coercion he had to go to in order to achieve her smiling at him. He had inspired her to care about him, even love him, remembering now that she had asked him to not bring the word love into it, and he'd allowed that despite. He cared for her. It mattered. It was like a parasitic vine that climbed along her skin and mind, dug in and fed on her, with her unable to tear him out for long before his patient climb and digging roots sank in again, and she welcomed him home. If she did manage to tear him out, there were scars shaped like him wherever she experienced herself. She couldn't get the distance or the autonomy needed for any perspective about how she felt or what she wanted. He had defined what she wanted and how she felt for too long. She kept trying to reach back to her mind before she had seen Beckenstein, and that seemed cold and remote, lacking perspective, lacking knowledge, lacking. She had been simple. She was no longer simple. She was also no longer alone. not knowing which parts of her were grafted on by him, which sway toward or away from him was intentional or engineered by him. All that mattered was that he was everywhere. She couldn't ask him. He'd lie or be amused, and she would never know. His lies were more convincing than her truths, and his truths were even more devastating. She could not go back to being the person naive enough to walk down an alley on Ilium without a thought, the person that had looked at him in the mirror and told him earnestly that he should let her go, or Drell would die. Her ears hurt, stinging, whistling, not with sound, but with the pain from the stuttering movement of stale air, chill and burn of exposed nerve with each breath and shift in movement. She didn't know what he had done, but he wasn't concerned with her comfort or pain at the moment, and she was immobilized without any give on her bonds. Pain in her ears, cramps and trembling of her muscles from being too long in one position. She had thought maybe he would kill her, and maybe that was a good thing. It had looked like he would there for a moment, and she had tried to get him to do it when it came to that by promising him, as she had before, that she would kill him if she could. If he knew her eyes, then he'd have seen that there. Stuck in Bekenstein, it had only been her that had paid any price. It had been between just the two of them. She'd even had a bizarre sense of humor about it, some perspective, some hope that the sick thing he was could stop being a sick thing. The sheer waste of his potential was enough to make her ill and grieving. She had wanted to save him. She never really thought she could, but she had wanted to. Somehow. If she'd had that man on her side, the thing she could do, could have done. The man who was passionate and dedicated, careful and observant. The man with a strategic mind and a body built and honed to kill. She felt a wave of blood flush through her skin, and her heart pounding in her already painful ears. No sound, just remembered sensation, now raw and ragged. Admit it, Cara. Body honed for sex, and a voice you begged to hear more from any number of times. He said you were going to beg to hear that he loved you, and sick as that makes you, he's going to make it happen. I'm his unbreakable toy. He wouldn't have made that threat without carrying it out. He'll do it. Now or later. Before, she'd said she loved him spontaneously, and he had appreciated it, even protected her from the vulnerability of not having love returned. He'd made her feel loved. She never had been able to decide whether that was something kind or vile in him, or, again, both. He knew how to get her there, to have her say she loved him. Having his silence or scorn in return would shatter her every time. Of course he knew it. She'd beg, she'd wait for his answer. She had no idea what it would be, shattering, or his ability to lie, his appreciation of joyous irony with venom in her blood, and his body on hers, in hers, her hands holding him as tightly to her as she could. There was no preparing herself for that, only enduring it. If he made her love him, that was her seeking him every moment, and wouldn't that just be his favorite thing ever? Her eyes always looking to him. He'd already achieved that, and knew he could do it again. All he needed was time to rebuild her priming. This time, without indulgence or forgiveness. This time with his primary experiences of her being wrath and rejection, with him not willing to feel that himself without sharing. Capturing her had been a whim. Keeping her would be something he considered a necessity, something that had delivered to him deep, unhealed wounds. She'd experienced loving someone unrequited. She'd love him, and she'd feel the loss of the love he once made her feel. She'd experience sexual abuse. She would thank him for providing in order to break the monotony of her useless days. So much more painful as he counted all the things she was unaware she should be feeling, should be doing. As she sat and watched him paint her nails and felt as though she were the luckiest woman in existence. She was in the belly of a reaper, blood staining the bedding again. Ushered out for playtime. On Bekenstein she had understood the playtime, and here she did not understand except to know it was bad. The expressions on his face, the things he could do, the fact that he had a tether to the core of a reaper somehow. He had the Citadel with her codes, he had the Normandy with her compliance, and now he had a reaper. Maybe reapers. And why wasn't he doing as he'd done on the Normandy? Why wasn't he letting her take charge again? Why was she tied down? It wasn't that he couldn't control her, because he obviously could, enough to provide recorded reports. It was because he had things he had to do, and those things should terrify her, whatever they were. She'd been worried before about escaping him, combined with stopping him from harming another person. Now she was convinced, viscerally, that she had to kill him, and that was her first priority. He had once needed her, but maybe he wouldn't for long. Maybe he didn't anymore at all. Maybe he had everything he needed, and she didn't know. She did not know. She remembered when he'd questioned her on the throne, asking her, was the Asari there of her own free will or a slave? And did she not know the answer? What would she stake on her answer? The Asari's life and potential torture? Her own fate, if she was traded off in her place? She did not know what he wanted then. She did not know what he wanted now. Whatever he was doing, she should be terrified. He'd said something true then. You don't know. It's your job to know, Drelova. Your job as Commander Shepard, and you can't make what seems like an obvious decision in a room full of criminals that all deserve to die. Me first, with your wits intact, and no venom. He was right. It's my job as Commander Shepard not to survive, not to save Garrus, but to stop him. I have to stop him, whatever he is doing. I have to finally reach the point of realizing that whatever he is doing, he has enough power to do enough harm that I have to stop him, and know that's my goal. I need to make an obvious decision while I'm tied down that in this room, he is the criminal who deserves to die. somehow make that choice in every ongoing moment. While she had a choice at all, she absolutely had to find a way. Time passed. She tried to think about how to find that way. Her wits were intact, and she still didn't know how, what, or most important at the moment, if. Garrus, I am so sorry. I wish you could hear me. I know you haven't given up all the messages I read and deleted, and I sent you no answer. You saw no ripple in me. You got no response. All the words you said and all the ways you could express that you loved me, you were there for me. You wanted to be or get for me everything and anything I needed. The worst part is that I loved you. I love you. I needed you and I need you. And you love me and you need me. And I am so sorry for helping him. I asked him to let you live. And now I can't save you. Maybe he never was going to let you live. I shouldn't have helped him. And I don't know that I had a choice. I should have had a choice. I should have been able to stop helping him. You deserve a woman who could have done that for you, Garrus. I should have killed him those first 10 minutes, found my way out, found my way back to you. I was supposed to save the galaxy, and I couldn't and can't break out of a room. And once again, he was right. Hubris was and is part of my calculations. If I have a choice, Garrus, if I ever have one again, my last name is Thane, and I love you. I'm so sorry. He's right about some things. I should have done everything for you. I shouldn't have stayed away. I should have let you come back on the Normandy. That's what you wanted. I know some things about free will now that I should have known then. He'd only have been able to kill me then. You'd miss me, but it would have been clean, and we would have been together. There are things worse than death, Garrus. And for me, so many of those things are knowing what I decided, knowing what I've said and what I haven't said, who I've been and what he's done, and that it happened not just to me, but to you. Knowing I could have prevented it if I'd done things your way. If I'd been able to kill him and escape. Now, I've lost my chance to be yours. He can make me forget. And he can tear you out from the roots. His vines planted in the bleeding holes left behind. Now I'm not even in the fight against Reapers. He did it. He made himself my only fight. And I am so sorry. I love you so much. And I never deserved you. And I never will. I know if you were here, you'd smile and tell me none of that was true. And I miss you so much. She allowed herself to cry, to talk to Garrus, to imagine his voice, because she hadn't in so long. She composed answers to all the messages he'd sent her. If she was going to die or forget, she wanted her bondmate with her at the end. Please, please let there be an afterlife. I wish I had more time. I need to tell you so many things. I need to let you know that I heard you. Finally. Garrus, I'd meet you at the bar, but I don't drink it. You're the only one that knows that. Or you were. I'd meet you anywhere, and I would drink for you, but you'd never ask me to do that for you. Sinar never asked her to drink either. It was twisting and turning in on her, and she couldn't think of Garrus without it changing back to her only fight. She cried silently, and all she had left to give was the whirl of adrenaline, fear, and pain. That's all he had of her. She didn't hear him because, of course, she didn't hear anything. A pinch at her neck, and she was paralyzed. She didn't know if it was cowardly or brave that she hoped she didn't wake up. She did know it was wishful thinking. Another pinch, and everything went dark. She did wake up. Compounded horror jolted her wide awake. She was back on Beckenstein? Had she ever left? Had it all... Was it all a dream? A lie? Same mirror, same... No, he was Rin, not Thane. There was something different. She remembered the difference. How many times had he done this to her? Maybe she hadn't come back to life at all. Maybe this was hell. Just enough time to know she loved Garrus and he loved her, enough to suffer with that. Then nothing but a drowse, dull dream. They both wore the same clothes they had the first time. Their room was exactly the same in the mirror. Same hand at her throat, only this time red and blue blending to purple, not black and green. Same hand at her waist, only this time knowing, glowing blue, caressing instead of restraining. His eyes met hers in the mirror again. How many times had he done this to her? She smelled like Vannis fruit again. Had he made her believe they had gotten out together? There was nothing to hold on to that was true except for Vannis fruit and all the ways it made her want to fall to her knees and vomit. But he held her up. Panic in huge waves hit and swamped her. Hell. This is hell, and you keep making the same mistake. And looking for a reason, looking for hope. And he'll give it to you if you ask. Then he'll take it away. His hand at her throat moved to stroke back her hair. He tilted her head to the side and nuzzled at her throat with his mouth, his nose, his tongue. I do learn some things, Cara. I gave you an antiemetic. You have strong reactions to the sight of me. I will not give you the opportunity to kill me this time. I know your answer. This time. How many times had he done this to her? She didn't know the answers to so many basic questions. Where am I? Who am I? Who is he? She didn't know the answers except that all three could be answered by hell. Didn't she say to herself, didn't she try to decide that she'd do it differently if she had a chance, that she'd try to kill him, that she'd try to get away? What was there to lose? What was there to be gained? It didn't matter anymore. If this was her constant future, her eternal present, this room, the mirror, his eyes, and his mouth. Hell means no matter what you do, you will end up back in front of this mirror, and you will do it again, and again, and again. No hesitation, no bargaining. Her body erupted into fight and flight. She wanted to kill him and get out the door. Security kills her, and then it's over. It's over. Her foot lifted to try to break his toes, and his foot was not there when hers landed. Her head jerked to the side. The intent was to slam against his head, to take out one of her ears again with the impact, to clap her hand to the other side of her head and get him down. Just as her foot had landed on empty space, her head hit nothing, and her arm was twisted behind her back, and it was over. Beyond that, she didn't have any conscious plan, but she had frenzy. And soon, she wasn't in front of the mirror anymore, but on the bed, where she was always going to be headed anyway. Lack of provocation, or provocation on her part, would result in the same thing. He could always decide whether or not her answers were right or wrong, depending on his mood. He was smiling, and that meant he had all the power he needed. He was back to indulgent and giving. Somehow, some way, she was in hell. Or she had never left. Or, while she was sleeping and paralyzed, he'd gotten his time. She could see in his eyes. He'd gotten everything he needed. And she would never know if it was months later or minutes. How many times had he done this to her? His legs were wrapped around hers to restrain her. His hands held hers over her head. He was still so much bigger than she was, so much faster. His smile undimmed, his eyes approving, proud of his pet's resolve. He bent his head to kiss her, and she tried to bite, but his lips and tongue were far from where she intended her teeth to be, as though they had done this so many times that he knew her every move. Or only because she was so very predictable in her desperation and his practiced experience. Venom was trickling into her system from his hands, and kiss blew biotics in the close of her teeth on nothing. His mouth moved to her ear, where there was an earring, where he tasted it. He restrained both her hands in one of his own while he took that earring. Her hands twisted in his. Her body attempted to throw him off while he held her down. He caused her no pain. He allowed her no freedom. He pulled back and looked down at her. She wished she saw fear or anger, but there was only indulgence and even pity for her in his eyes. She no longer qualified as inspiring fear. Maybe she never had, and I was only the hope of hell, built only for the pleasure of crushing it. He spoke in a voice she hadn't heard from him before. Senard's voice? His real voice? You deserve to know, Cara. I have decided that I love you. I have decided that you hate me. Because I love you. You are alive. I do not believe either of us had a choice. I do not believe in your definition of love, but in mine. I do not believe in your definition of hate, but in mine. Is that not what you always wished of life, Cara? That love triumph over hate? I will make it so. My love will triumph over your hatred. I sought you out for your inspiration, and that remains. You value yourself as less than nothing, only a catalyst for change in other people, never yourself. I have faced gods and asked myself what I want from them or any other god, and I choose you. Above all things, my Cara, I choose you. I will keep you from dying ever again. I will keep you from those who seek or allow your death, your martyrdom. I will stop you from sacrificing yourself. I value you over everything else in the galaxy. I stand before gods, and I ask only for you. And if that is not love, then the word means nothing. I will let the galaxy end, Cara, if it means you will live. I have found a way to keep you safe. Safe from your own willingness to die in every moment. I have been, and I am, willing to die to extend your life. You have been, and you are, willing to die to end my life. If you are willing to abandon everything you care for in order to end me, if that is not hate, then the word means nothing. I forgive your hatred. I forgive your love of another man. It is not your fault that you love him. It is not his fault that he loves you. I will not kill him. He does not matter any longer. I made a rash vow in anger, and I regret it. Forgive me. I have found my path, Cara, and my path is you. I do not wish to see you suffer. I wish to grant you joy. No, thank you. My Cara. He kissed her again, his indulgence in full bloom, venom creeping in through every barrier she tried to place. forming cracks in the darkness where it seeped through. He held up his free hand. It was bare, and then it wasn't. A glistening net draping his hand in the colors of the earrings he made for her, gemmed violet and black and silver. My Cara, inspiration does not always come from you. Fortunately, you have been unavailable, and I have found my way. I have designed many gifts for you, but this is the finest and the most cherished. Here is your joy, Cara. Here is freedom from hatred and sacrifice. I have been cruel and blunt. I have forced you to forget. Here is your memory whole and your actions right. Here is how I will love you. Here is how I need not rob you of yourself, but only take one thing away and add one thing in its place. You will not hate me. You will love me, and I will not make you beg. I give myself to you. We will be together, always. With a swirl of his hand, the net was on her hair, and then tightening, shifting through her skin and bone into her head. Painless and warm, like the blue glow of biotic sinking in and through. Part of her. Part of him. His mouth bent to hers, and she reached back to him, his voice inside her head. New and welcome. You will always be able to hear me, Cara. I will always be able to hear you. He is yours. She remembered everything, and the shift of lighting made a new landscape. One shared, never alone. He had saved her, protected her, rescued her, loved her, and she loved him back. She thought, she is yours. And she knew he heard her, would always hear her, would always save her, protect her, rescue her, love her. His voice was in her mind, his biotics on her skin, his lips along her mouth, venom on her tongue. I beg you, my Cara, tell me what it is I most long to hear, what I have missed from your lips, what I should never have forsaken because you asked. I will never forsake you because you ask. Never again ask me to leave you, to allow you to suffer. I will not allow it. I love you, Cara. Tell me you love me. Her freed hand stroked along the sides of his frill, fingertips spread out wide to touch the edges, her palm against venom-slick textures of him. I love you. I always have. I always will. She knew what he wanted, knew what he needed, his voice inside her head. She would never be alone again. Hell transformed to heaven in a blink with his gifts. Forgiveness, understanding, and love.